First and foremost, welcome everyone for joining us. We're going to spend the next 45 to 50 minutes really taking a look at SFL in a very North American context. And I point that out because within SFL, of course, context matters a lot. Context really lets you know what's going on with the language, why it's being used as it is. So of course, our workshop today is really calling it out a workshop toward pushing North American genre pedagogy toward color consciousness. And so the activities that we'll be taking part in later on in the presentation will really help us really think about not just having race as a subtext, but having it as a major text in the conversation of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so, of course, I'm Jason Mizell. I'm at the University of Miami, and I'm joined by Kathryn Accurso, who is at the University of British Columbia, and also Holly Graham, who is with Mount Holyoke, but who is also a fabulous, you'll see that later on, middle school teacher who's doing some really fabulous work with the kids who this work really impacts day to day in their living. So as we really think more about what systemic functional linguistics is, it really operates at three different levels. It's at one level, what we call the ideational metafunction of how ideas are really put together, how they're expressed. Then there's the interpersonal, and the interpersonal is really how we relate to other people, how texts relate, these power relationships, and of course the textual, which is really the flow of discourse, and how that looks in different contexts. And then from that, we're going to spend some time really speaking a lot more about genre pedagogy. And genre pedagogy within this is sort of where a lot of this work is really going to, what we call the rubber will meet the road, is within the genre pedagogy realm. And with genre pedagogy, of course, it's really all about how do you scaffold things so students can notice, name, and practice what's going on. And this is also really brought through the teaching learning cycle. Of course, with the teaching learning cycle, you're helping them learn how to build background knowledge of a curriculum topic. Then you're really guiding them through it. And then there's the deconstruction of it. How do you break those little pieces down so that they know exactly the components of it? And then the joint construction. When you're putting those components back together with the student, so they're being guided and apprenticed, and then the independent part, where the student is able to hopefully do it independently. And yet, since it is a cycle, it is just that. You may go back to another parts you've already covered because the student needs that. And so genre pedagogy really sets up different genres, whether that's a narrative, which is one I love because I love to work with little kids. So it really brings that home to them so that they can tell what's going on. So of course, within schooling, there are these dominating genres. And we call them dominating genres because these institutions have decided that this is what is important to them. And there are different types. So we go all the way from the personal, what we call the recount, which are on the personal side, all the way up to the analytical with discussion on the other side. And so there's all these different schooling genres that schools value. And we're going to do a little bit more talking about some of the aspects or the stages of those different genres. So I'm really trying to speed through a lot of this because I think it's really important that we get to the meat of the activity. But then of course, as we think about these genres within the North American context, in North America, as you can see from the slide, between 2000 and 2019, we've had lots of authors write about and use SFL, which is a very important and powerful tool. And yet, as this important and powerful tool has been used, as you can see, for the most part, race was never mentioned. So there's this color evasive language that was going on. And then when you talk about authors talking about anti-racism, or how do you make sure you're not being racist, there's really zero mentions of that. So of these 147 authors, only 15 of them name racism or racist factors and really what's going on. So with just this sort of metadata, you can really see in the North American context, race really has not been something that we've looked at. And so through this workshop, we're going to refocus that and really take a look at race, because race is a very salient part of what goes on in our educational system. Because one of the things that CRT really brings out is that race is quote unquote normal. It is a foundational part of our societies. And so we need to make sure that that's sort of part of our work so that our students are getting what they need in order to be successful.
Now, what Jason talked about, and thank you, Jason, for that wind up. When Jason mentioned about this being very relevant in schools, we wanted to point out that it's really not just us kind of thinking through this issue together. Part of the reason that we're here offering the workshop is because the teachers that we work with are sort of noticing these tensions about the sort of approaches that we're using to language instruction and the larger discourses about the purpose for that and where they feel caught in a bit of a dilemma. And so one teacher who expressed the tension she's experiencing preparing to do the job of language teaching in elementary schools, in this case, mentioned that she said, "I think a big issue I have with academic language is that it's not a fair game. I feel like I'm supposed to teach academic language in standard English, but it also seems like these are just codes for teaching white and upper middle class ways of writing and talking." So she feels like she's walking some kind of line between supporting her students' language development and also acknowledging that it's not a level playing field, so to speak, and that different people's bilingualism is perceived in different ways. And so we wanted to just acknowledge that it's something impacting teachers as well. Now, of course, we also know it's kind of a hot topic in academic language circles of scholars as well. And so, for example, a recent manifesto by Ofelia Garcia and others in collaboration kind of critiques or notices this same line, pointing out that there's been really a lot of attention, and they don't mention SFL scholarship specifically, but I believe are sort of categorizing it as a body of scholarship that spent a lot of time distinguishing academic from non-academic language, or we might think about the ways that we've used labels like academic discourse versus everyday language, and my own scholarship included there. And they offer the critique that we should question the degree to which those are empirical distinctions, or the idea that, as it's bolded here on the slide, that that distinction isn't so clear. And Halliday, even at a time, kind of questioned that distinction himself and tested it out in the language of science literature. But Ofelia Garcia and her colleagues mentioned that because it's not such a clear division, that they're purporting that attempts to identify detectable linguistic characteristics of academic language and then teach them, particularly to minoritized students, may stem from idealized representations of texts that are produced mostly by white monolingual English users, occupying a particular dominating social position. And there's, at the bottom of that slide too, some other scholarship within the SFL community that points to a similar critique. And so in our workshop and our work, we're trying to kind of take up that critique and address the question, or the degree to which North American SFL practice, specifically the way genre pedagogy gets enacted in teacher education and in K-12 schools, to what degree is that part of a racist practice, or history, perhaps? And so the way we're coming at that argument, the way we're thinking about it as a team, and I'll let Jason and Holly, of course, add their thoughts as well, is that as a group of scholars who are really interested in context, that maybe the self-critique we can sort of take and offer to the community is that as much as we may be thinking about the social justice aspect of our work, we really haven't been explicitly attending to the racist context in which the language of schooling has grown up. So we're not making a critique about academic language as a construct. What we're talking about is our lack of attention to that piece of historical context that's kind of unavoidable. And so what we're starting to think about is where does it get us if we begin to think about the racist contexts in which academic language or disciplinary language has grown up? And what does that mean for our teaching of language in academic contexts now?
If I could add to that.
Please do.
as you really think about the genres and as they're formed and what we really look at, and you think about other ways of talking and doing, I mean, I reflect sometimes on what happened in the 80s and 90s in California with the whole Ebonics movement. There are schools that were going to teach and really explain to kids the linguistic moves that were happening within Ebonics or Black English. And that was really shot down because a lot of their argument was, is it's not professional enough. It's not academic enough. And the question has to come out was, why? What makes one language more important than the other, or one way of explaining things more important than the other? And I think that's where we're coming into this work, is not saying that the tools we're using don't have some explanatory power, but why are those tools being used as they are, and what are those tools rarefying in the process?
Which led us to this direct question, which I think has been lurking at the edge of our fields for a little while without being articulated explicitly. And so that was the moment at which we found ourselves, is what happens if we just ask outright, is genre pedagogy racist? Or in what way may it have participated in what's well-documented history of racism in North America? So Jason, where did we land on this?
Well, I think as we really looked at that, and we're really thinking about, well, what language is being valued and how is it being valued? And so if you really look at, there is a preference for whiteness. There is a preference for replicating what is seen as important and professional in white communities. And so if it is a preference, then that does mean that it is racist, that there's a problem that's going on there that we need to take care of. Now, we're not saying that kids don't need to learn about this. They need to learn the structures that are there so they can critically, and I think that's the thing that I love about SFL, they can critically learn to examine, and they can critically learn to really break it down. And so that has really led us to start really experimenting with, how do you make sure the students are able to explicitly notice what's going on, call out what's going on, but then also bringing in community ways of languaging and examine those also critically at the same time.
Absolutely. And we acknowledge the sort of degree to which scholars have taken up this question over the last few decades. And we know that there's been a lot of discussion around the kind of access paradox, right, which Jason is talking about here. To what extent do we, so to speak, throw the baby out with the bathwater? We're not talking about not teaching disciplinary language practices in school, but we are saying that maybe we need to talk about the things that we're not talking about in the work, or that we're talking about to the side of the publications and presentations that we do. Because the folks here and many others too, I think, are actively critically engaged scholars, but it doesn't necessarily show up in the literature. And that's the point Jason was making earlier through that thematic analysis of the literature.
Right. And I think that's the other thing that we point out, is one of the things that April Baker Bell in her last book points out is that in so many cases you had people of color using standard English, and that did not save their lives. So what can we do in order to show students explicitly what's happening in schools, what genres are valued in schools, at the same time truly valuing other ways of producing knowledge? And this is also one of the things that, like, Lisa Del Pitt talks a lot about, how if you only teach students how to uphold the system, then they're becoming cogs, and the system's really causing their own oppression. Whereas if you teach them also how to deconstruct it, then that's where liberation can come in. So that's where we're sort of coming at this work, is saying, these are the tools. How are we using those tools? Can those tools be refashioned? What are we looking at, and what can we do?
So what we're going to share here in the next few slides before we hop into our workshop activities is a set of ideas that we started merging with our SFL praxis from critical race theory. And Jason's going to walk us through a few of the key concepts that we started to consider how to merge with SFL praxis. And just also noting that when we started thinking about how to put these concepts together with tenets from SFL and genre pedagogy, critical race theory didn't have the same kind of dog whistle status that it does now in the US and to some degree in Canada as well. But Jason, tell folks what we were borrowing on before CRT was in so many mouths and social media.
Yes, exactly. So we really looked at 4 different concepts. One of them is sort of what I mentioned earlier, the unexceptionality of racism in schools. If we look at the history of US schooling, when we looked at when schools were formed, who they were formed for, schools were formed not for, and I'll be explicit about that, not for people of color. They're formed usually for white landowners and their children. So that's this whole idea of the unexceptionality of racism in school, which also can be looked at through IQ testing and other things of that nature. We also really borrowed from intersectionality. Intersectionality, of course, is by Crenshaw, and the whole idea that you have to look at each of the different facets or parts of a person in order to really see what's going on. So it isn't just a race, it can be race, gender, languaging practices, ability, disabilities, all those really come together through intersectionality. And of course, the voice of color is paying attention to the fact that those who have suffered discrimination, they have a special relationship and a special knowledge because they have suffered through it. And then of course, culture-sustaining pedagogy is how the cultures, the languages, ways of doing value for themselves, not as this magical bridge to take them to what I call the promised land of whiteness. So what culture-sustaining pedagogy is just that. How do you sustain the cultures of those students and their values? They're being judged for themselves, not against this sort of white measuring stick that a lot of times happens in our schools.
So putting those concepts together with the sort of teaching and learning cycle that's often captured by folks working with genre pedagogy and folks who are here as well, extending it in some really interesting and critical ways. What we're conceptualizing as one possible approach to an anti-racist SFL praxis is keeping that highly interactive nature of the SFL teaching and learning cycle, but adding a piece to that sort of systematic scaffolding where students and teachers are practicing and scaffolded to also see and talk about the way that not just linguistic patterns unfold in schools and society, but also the way that those are intertwined with patterns of racialization. And in some cases, mutually constitute one another. So a practice of noticing and attending to something that we haven't necessarily through this pedagogy before.
And with that pedagogy, of course, really looking at, as you go through the language itself, how race is really talked about. I mean, you can't see it, but yeah, my background covers it out. But I have a book in front of me about Christopher Columbus. And as I was reading through that, race is really constituted over and over through language. And so making sure that teachers have those tools so they can really bring attention to it. Now, of course, that brings us to sort of our 5 principles of praxis rather. And that's what we're really thinking about. How do you go about teaching community countertext? For example, if you have the book that you can't see because of my background about Christopher Columbus, how do you bring in a community countertext that teachers and students can also examine? It's from the point of view and the history of the community. How do you really pay attention to the ideology? Because every text, I think, as SFL scholars, we can admit, every text has an ideology. How are you paying attention to explicit ideology? And then this increase on interpersonal meanings. This, of course, are those power dynamics. And this is where a lot of this really comes out. How are people being positioned? And then the promoting of remixing of genres. How do we explicitly teach kids and ourselves, our pre-service teachers, what are the different stages that are involved? And how can those stages from dominating text, which kids are expected to learn in schools, how do those stages really look inside of community value text? And how can they really remix those for what they need? And there are authors out there like Toni Morrison and others who do a wonderful job of that, who really remix these different genres for their own purposes so they're effective. And then really practice anti-racist assessment. how do we go about not just using or not using at all that white measuring stick? How do we come up with authentic assessment tools to see what our students know using all of their linguistic abilities, all of their literacy skills? And then how do we go about really valuing that and being able to assess it so that we can help our students grow so that they can truly become these remixers so they can get what they need out of life. Now, with this, I love me some Hassan because Hassan is so explicit. She definitely says that language, that you use language to shape reality, but you also use it to defend reality. And something Kathryn mentioned earlier, we see that going on right now with the talk about CRT. People are using this language about CRT to sort of deform what the reality is. So language is used to shape it, it's used to defend it. And if that is what is happening, it can also be used to examine the reality that's been created. So that's why we want to bring these two different worlds together so that we can truly be race conscious as we're teaching our students and ourselves to examine what's going on in our languaging practices.
So if you've heard Jason and I talk about these ideas before, this bit may have been a repetition for you. And what you're looking forward to here is an example of what do we mean by examining reality using countertexts in SFL. And so what we're going to get to today is working with a pair of countertexts that come to us from grade 7 social studies. And this is just a little snippet of the text that we'll be working with today. Sort of canonical social studies text from a textbook, and then an excerpt from Stamped, the youth adaptation of Stamped from the Beginning, this one by Jason Reynolds, his adaptation of Ibram X. Kendi's book. So just a teaser, this is what we're getting into. And before we get into that part, we're just going to take a quick 5-minute break so folks can stretch, let those ideas sit in, settle in, and then we're moving on to the interactive part of the workshop. So you will be talking to each other, working with texts. There may be some breakout rooms involved, just so you can get in that headspace now of listening mode to activity mode. So we will come back here in 5 minutes and you hear the sound of our voices, and we look forward to seeing you then and getting started. A quick note for folks who are watching this workshop as a recorded video. After the fact, you can still join in with the workshop activities by accessing the texts that we worked with and the tasks that you're about to hear about at the link shown here. Okay, now back to the workshop. All right, everybody, welcome back. Welcome back. Hello, hello. All right, wonderful to see a couple folks joining us now at this point too. I'm going to turn the floor over to Holly to give us a bit of a wind up about what we're going to be looking at and working with here. Holly, tell us about what we need to know to get into our activity today.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be part of this group. And I always say to Kathryn, I can't, she liked my Mount Holyoke lesson, I think more than anyone at Mount Holyoke did, where I teach a course. So I appreciate so much being invited. So in my life, I teach middle school humanities, which is English and social studies. And then I also teach an SFL course at Mount Holyoke College on Zoom right now because I live in the Pacific Northwest temporarily. And I say that because I've taught in 3 spaces now: Boston, Western Massachusetts, and the Pacific Northwest. And I'm struck in the PNW about how much my Native American students are struggling, which was not a dynamic that I experienced in Western Massachusetts or Boston, but still the same issues of representation and sort of bending into the wills of a curriculum that's, even if we look at the genres, there's still dominant genres that are set up and maintained linguistically and grammatically, or lexicogrammar by a white middle class sort of dominated discourse pattern. So I always begin by teaching, when I feel like I can say, when I have the same slide that I use with my middle school students and my seniors in college at Mount Holyoke, then it must be relevant, because neither group will look me in the eye when I say, we're going to do some clause breaks and we're going to find the verb, right? And I think, wow, I wonder if I looked Dr. Gebhardt in the eye when she told me that probably 10 years ago, who's on this call. So I like to introduce by saying all the language we have is so functional, right? And we're so lucky that we get to choose the words that we want to use to function in the way that we want to represent. And I still notice no one looks me in the eye when I have the word verb or process on the screen. So I always put up this dog who's lifting weights. And in my middle school classroom, I actually have a pile of weights that I've obtained from multiple tag sales, which they don't call them that in the PNW. So I don't know what they're called. And we lift weights because we say the thing about language is it's got a really big job, but parts of it have bigger jobs than others. And so don't worry about finding the action verb or stressing over is or are quite yet, eventually. But let's just talk about this part of speech, which we can kind of move along and just say type of language that does so many jobs for us. So before we find clauses, we can find these processes. And in my work, I really try to use the language of participant, process, and circumstance. And I've sat in so many meetings with UMass people where we all agree that middle school students are like, okay, but it's adults that are like, I can't use that language. No one will know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to try to use participants, processes, and circumstances of you all. And I don't know, if you get upset, just Zoom chat me. We can talk about it. So this is because I'll also say my work has really been a lot with second language speakers who are in the general curriculum. And for them to realize that a participant goes through a process in a clause, and sometimes there's more information or more to know about them, is really useful for reading and writing. Whether or not anybody understands you outside of the room isn't really my big concern, but I do see students gravitating towards, oh, I get that. So processes, they do so many jobs in English, and in other languages, they don't do quite as many jobs, which is a really interesting discussion, right? There are other languages that have more aspect tense and things that we don't have in English. So it's kind of a bummer that we put so much pressure on this one job because it determines our tense, our possibility. Like, I could do this, I may do that, we might get to this today, we probably won't, so it kind of determines possibility. It's the state of being, it's how we tell each other how we're feeling. I move away from like the conjugation squares on the board of to be, I am, you are, he is. My students have done that and they have found it ineffective for the most part. So unless they're actually second language speakers, and then they can whip it right off, right? And so, but I say, but I'm cold, or this is boring, Miss Graham, right? Or sometimes I'm weird, and we say, I got to be something and I have to get myself there. So I just relate myself to something and I have this super cool verb that helps me do it, or process. Verbs take the negative, processes take the negative. I can, I can't, I will, I won't, I do, I don't. These are just so heavy. And that's why we hold on to the weights, because we think, oh, this is just so much pressure on language. They're discipline specific. I bring that up with sixth graders and seniors in college. And I think the sixth graders get it. I'm not sure about the seniors in college. Sometimes they say, no, they're not. Right. But scientists have a really special way of using verbs. And so do sixth graders, and so do school principals, and so do people at the grocery store. We all have this really special way of using verbs We just are usually not that aware of it, but it's fascinating to see that we can do that. And they carry content. So they do way more than action. One of the things we always do is we do a lot of motions, and you can do the motions if you want. Verbs happen in our head. You can't see them. There's no action there, but you can worry and wonder, and you can, you can be in a state of unhappiness, and there's lots of things that goes on in your head. So we always say we have verbs in our head. They're mental. We have verbs that come out of our mouth. Teachers have way too many words that come out of our mouths. We have verbal verbs, verbal processes. We yell, we gossip, we scream, we whisper, we cry. And those aren't necessarily all actions. Especially if you teach middle school with masks on your face, you can't see how much talking goes on. And then we behave. We behave, and sometimes we can see those behaviors and sometimes we can't. So there's so many things that verbs do, and they're just so much cooler than just an action is really what we get at. And then I say to them, you know what, some English teachers are going to get really into this, like taking object and indirect objects, and that happens. Sometimes there's a participant after the process, and sometimes that there's not. It's really good to look for when you're reading, because you might learn that there's two participants happening. But I don't get into the, syntactic logistics of it. And I find that this sort of verbs are so heavy, I know it's hard, explanation sets everybody up to relax a little, to understand that they don't know a lot more about this than they think they do, and also to find the clause. So we're going to ask you to find some clauses today. But I wanted to show you one really funny slide that I did not tell Kathryn and Jason I was putting in, but I had to take a picture of this one day. I was working with some 8th graders on the best short story. Everyone should read it. It's called Olakoi. It's by Adichie. It is a Nigerian representation of doctors and lawyers in Nigeria. And it's such a brilliant story. And it talks about vaccinations, which is hot, right? But I was trying to show them how grammar changes when she's having a memory versus when she's explaining, and showing that both genres have such value, right? We don't always need to be reading explanations. Like, this is what Jason talks about as a community valued text. This is written by a Nigerian author who grew up in Nigeria with parents who worked at a university and had a very educated life, and she wants the audience to know it. So she flashbacks to the story about her birth, which obviously she has to recall from oral tradition. So it's just a brilliant story. And it's got so many genre shifts in it that really all value the story and the explanation, which I love. So we were just kind of looking at how the function of process types shifts. And this is from a first language speaker. I said, Nate, write down 3 things you just learned about verbs in English after we looked at this. And he said, verbs are terrible, but they do lots of work. There are so many tenses, and a flipping contraction can be a verb. I was glad that he wrote flipping, honestly. You never know. Anyway, so that I didn't tell them that, but it's one of my favorite slides because I think it captures the heart of they can do it, they can find it. And it's moving away from, behaviorist underline the verb, even though that's what they did do, and looking at, what kind of happens in a text. So I like to say to my Mount Holyoke students, don't be clause perfect. And they can't help it. And none of us can, because I imagine a lot of us were raised in contexts where grammar was right or wrong. And if we're really listening to what Kathryn and Jason were saying in the introduction, that is a core component to move away from. It instantly creates a very myopic view of what is English, or you could apply that to any language, right? So I begin by looking at texts and having students find some verbs that were working together or working by themselves. So had been written, do not get into tense or modality. Underline the whole thing. Had been written, had spread, had to do was figure out, and we underline the whole group together. And it takes a while at first, right? And I say, I know that you've spent a lot of time parsing verbs out and getting into these sort of sentence dissections. But for me, like, I want you to put language together. I don't want you to pull language apart. I never want you to pull language apart. I want to see how it works together. And then we use a single slash when we think that the verb has done its work It's all done its work. And you think I'm talking to sixth graders right now, but I have to talk to college kids this way too. And then a double slash when it's the end of the sentence. So sometimes it's as simple as finding verbs and putting in the double slashes for sentences. And then we work backwards. So I have watched teachers like Dr. Gebhardt be very relaxed with students and say, either way, it's okay. Don't stress. That looks good. Be consistent. And even if you're not consistent, that's okay. We want you to see some functioning parts of the sentence and break them down into clauses. And clauses' jobs start and finish around the job of the process when the process finishes. So I did a couple of reasons to, not sure about Siri's talking to me. I did a couple of these just to show how I would get started. And I also really want to say again, don't be clause perfect, be clause functional. And if you adopt that for yourself and you don't get into how many, am I right? Am I right? Am I right? It's much better for your students. Okay. You want me to keep going, Kathryn?
Well, I'll just say what I've put in the chat here is a link now to the text that we'll be working with. And thank you so much for that kind of encouragement or talking us down, actually, a little bit. I think you're right that in a group of folks who actually have a lot of knowledge and experience working with clauses and processes, I'd love to see how far we get in our 45 minutes of time together. And I think that does hinge on letting go of our tendency to make these clause perfect as language researchers. So I'll invite you all to join us in our texts for today. And Holly, can you give us a little context about these two texts? When I've shared them with folks in Canada before, I've realized, oh, wait a second, not everyone knows about the 3/5 compromise as part of the US Constitution. And that might be true of our audience today too. So tell us a little background.
So it was COVID, as I feel like every story begins. It was lockdown. And I had, like most people, was horrified by all of the things that unraveled, including the murder of George Floyd. So I gravitated towards Stamped. It was new at the time, and it was New York Times bestseller every single week. And I teach middle school, and I listened to it, which I strongly encourage anyone do if you get a chance. And I noticed when I was listening that I was understanding American history better. And I was noticing that these topics, which, I mean, I'm full confession here, I'm a certified history teacher, and I always have to look up these topics. What is that? What is that? What is that? It's the same with grammar. I'm always like, what's a gerund? What's a this, right? So these, for whatever reason, these haven't stuck with me in ways that are meaningful and functional. So he had gotten through a section on Cotton Mather, and then a few chapters later, he had gotten through a section on the 3/5 compromise. And I kept thinking, why am I understanding this? Like, he's engaging and he's awesome and he's great and he's just a fabulous storyteller, but it was more than that, right? It was more than that. So I became curious about the way that some of these topics are taught in the curriculum that I'm responsible for. Full disclosure, at the time I wasn't teaching US history. I hope I would know what the 3/5 compromise with a little more ease had I been teaching it, but I hadn't taught it in like 10 years. And so I went to the Massachusetts Common Core website and I downloaded the chapter that is assigned and approved and prescribed by the state. And there were other states that used it too. And it was a pretty benign chapter on the 3/5 compromise. And I listened to Stamped again and I read them against each other. And I became beyond curious because the first thing I noticed was that in the participant slot and the clauses, it was so much more, there was so much more power assigned to enslaved people. They were able to do something. They were able to achieve. Whereas in the 3/5 compromise textbook the textbook from the state of Massachusetts, they were always in the second participant, or what we would call the direct object position in a clause. And traditional grammar would call it direct object. And I kept thinking, what if this is what it's all like, right? What if the dominant discourse type is so subtly a transitive pattern that has impressed upon me, and therefore anyone like me, for my whole life as a student and as a teacher. And I don't know that I've ever had the tools to question it without SFL. So that's where this idea to do a full field tenor mode analysis and sort of genre comparison came from, not just for my own fun, but I really, I mean, all I did was have fun, but I wanted to bring this to university students.
Great. So these are the canonical text and the counter text that we'll be working with. And just to fill in a little of extra context too, when I went back and looked up these two texts online, I also thought it was so interesting the degree to which you could find reviews for one of them and not for the other. And many of us here have maybe gone down that hole looking at reviews on different things we consume, but we often don't get that for textbooks or canonical texts. And so I leave you with a little bit of this context here and some snippets from the reviews for the counter text. And we'll have our own reviews, I suppose, for the canonical text by the end of our time together. So the tasks that Holly's going to help guide us through today with these two texts, using the Google Doc there that you see the link to in the chat, we're going to do a few different kinds of SFL inspired analyses of these two texts to kind of illustrate how you might work with, or one way that an anti-racist genre pedagogy could work when you put together a canonical and a counter text. So we're going to talk about in breakout rooms some general impressions, tone, readability from our various perspectives. We're going to look at grammatical intricacy, see if there's anything interesting we learn or notice there. And then we're going to get into transitivity as much as time allows, and the interpersonal metafunction if we have a little time left at the end. So this is our workshop agenda for the rest of our time together. I'm going to click stop share now because we'll start working in that Google Doc. Okay. So does everyone have, by show of a little thumbs up, does everyone have the Google Doc open to them to work with? If not, now's a good time to get that open. Okay, those of you listening along, no worries. You can keep listening in your breakout room and we'll count on the thumbs up participants to help guide the tasks, okay? So I'm going to hit open breakout room and we're going to, in our two rooms, tackle task 1, which asks us to just read the two text excerpts and discuss our first impressions. And for folks who are more and less familiar with the curriculum context, the Constitution, the 3/5 Compromise, you can help fill in any background knowledge gaps for friends in your breakout room. And Holly, how long should we spend doing this? When will we come back to this room?
So I just have one suggestion, and that would be together right now to listen to Jason Reynolds read the Audible, and then to listen to me, the sort of white teacher, read the canon. I'm sorry, I hate that word. I'm so bad at it. I just don't know where the middle syllable is. And I think that is generally the deliverance of both of them. And I think it would be too hard to figure out how to play Audible in a breakout room, if I'm being honest. Actually, Kathryn, if you could read the state text, sorry to give you the most boring job, I will then have the Audible ready. It was ready, but it looks like somebody reset my Audible.
No problem. I'm happy to warm up a boring teacher voice for everyone.
Great.
Okay, here we are. This is passage 2 if you're in the Google Doc. So we're starting with passage 2, and then Holly will play the Audible for us of passage 1. So this again is from a state-supported American history textbook. By late 1787, the Constitution had been written and the Great Compromise had spread power and influence fairly among the states. All the framers had to do was figure out a way to calculate the population of each state and assign a number of representatives for them in the House of Representatives. This process became a problem, however, when Southern and Northern states began arguing over how much the slave population would affect representation. The debate began when Northern and Southern delegates disagreed over how many representatives each state would get based on their population. Delegates from the South wanted their slaves to count as people, so their total numbers would be larger than the Northern states. Northern delegates argued that slaves aren't allowed to vote and couldn't affect elections, so they shouldn't be counted at all. The Southerners argued back that they were still human beings and populations are based on the number of people in a region, so slaves counted. The debate continued on and the Southerners threatened to secede. It became clear that a compromise had to be reached. In order to solve the debate and set up House of Representatives, the Northern politicians proposed the 3/5 compromise. The Northerners agreed to count 5 slaves as 3 free men and add the total combination of slaves to the population of each state. The large number of slaves in the Southern states increased the number of representatives they had in Congress and put them on even footing with the largest Northern states. The Southern politicians used their increased influence to keep slavery legal for decades.
Thank you. All right, I'm all set. I had to go look at my subnotes to see where to start. There you go. Okay, so that is the assigned textbook in the state of Massachusetts. And then I am going to play for you what I heard and many have heard. And I was like, huh, that's clearer. So again, this is from this book. Everybody should teach it all the time, I think. Okay.
Which leads us to 2, the 3/5 compromise. The South wanted to play both sides of the fence. On one hand, they didn't want to count slaves as people, but instead wanted to count them as property because the greater the population, the more taxes you have to pay. But on the other hand, they needed more population because the greater the population, the more representation they got. And with more representation came more power. And the North was like, nope, slaves can't be human, because the North didn't have as many slaves and therefore couldn't risk letting the South have more power. So the compromise was to create a fraction. Every 5 slaves equaled 3 humans. So just to do the math, that's like saying if there were 15 slaves in the room, on paper, they counted as only 9 people. This 3/5 of a man equation worked for both the assimilationists and the segregationists because it fit right into the argument that slaves were both human and subhuman, which they both agreed on. For the assimilationists, the 3/5 rule allowed them to argue that someday slaves might be able to achieve 5/5, wholeness, whiteness, one day. And for segregationists, it proved that slaves were mathematically wretched. Segregationists and assimilationists may have had different intentions, but both of them agreed that Black people were inferior. And that agreement, that shared bond, allowed slavery and racist ideas to be permanently stamped into the founding document of America. While all this...
So when teaching this, I do exactly that. I read it and then I let Reynolds read it. And the first thing I say, and just going into your breakout rooms, is I just ask people to jot down the experience. And it's tempting to be like, Jason Reynolds was so much better, and which I agree. But when we do it again, and as we do it more and more, I invite you to listen to the grammar, which is hard, right? It's hard to do. I just told you that I was never going to be a scary grammar lady, but I do think that the clausal construction matters in the distinction between these two texts. And I hate to guide your breakout room, but I assume no one's going to come back and be like, that Massachusetts text is terrific. That is not the point. So you'll go into your breakout rooms with a little bit of a reflection of just sort of your experience of listening to the two texts. And then if you look at Kathryn's document, it takes you through some activities to look at, and you will be in a room with a helper and someone who's, able to talk about SFL. So if you're feeling anything like, wherever you are in your SFL journey, you'll get support on this activity.
Great. So how about if we go into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes then, and we'll get as far as we get as different groups, noticing what we notice from the juxtaposition of the two texts and the tasks Holly's put together for us. And we'll see what we find when we come back together.
Great.
Okay. Great. Breakout rooms are opening now. Folks working with this as a video workshop may want to hit pause now to work through some of the workshop tasks, either individually or in a small group. And then you can come back to this video to hear a bit of the discussion from groups that worked in breakout rooms during the live event. Hello, hello. I wonder if with the few minutes that we have left, if maybe we could just hear a couple of points of discussion that came up in each group. I think neither one of us made our way through the tasks in order the way they were laid out, and that's more than fine. I'm curious to know what kinds of observations or conversations we got into. Does anyone want to share for their group?
I can share. Oh, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
I was going to be that mean professor that I am and prop some people in my group, because I think we had some really great conversations. For example, Andreas, you sort of brought up the point of sort of our second of the 5 tenets. Could you share that a little bit? Because I thought that was really important, the way you framed it.
We were talking about grammar and about which one is more descriptive and all this. But in the 5 principles for praxis that you shared with us, principle number 2 is to pay explicit attention to ideology as part of ideation. And we were just busy looking at all these things, but we failed to actually disclose the fact that in text number 1, which is the stump one, not the textbook one, it was clearly an attitude that the 3/5 policy was a racist policy. Basically, it was named as that. And in the other one, through modality and other things, it was just like basically just a political problem to be solved. There was no humanity involved in it. There was no no attitude around it. It's simply history, like value in a very, very matter of fact way. You know, that really got me. And the only so I went to that only because you pointed that out in number 2 as a principle. So that's.
No, thank you for sharing that. And Khan, I'm going to be like professor again, because I did this in Khan's class. I called on people. I'm like, Khan, so what do you think? So Khan mentioned also about participants.
Thank you, Jason, for volunteering me. So actually, that for between the 2 passages here, I also for tracking participants. So I see that for passage number 1, so we use more pronoun, for example, the South, and then they to kind of label the participants. But for the second one, you know that it's more specific about the participants. For example, you can see the debate, the delegates, the northern delegates, the southern delegates, and also we have like northern politicians and then southern politicians. So more specific than the first one.
Yeah, and I'll just add with the first one, it brings in the humanity of who these enslaved people are. Whereas in number 2, you don't know who they are. It's just this sort of amorphous slave, but the humanity is never really pointed out. Whereas in number 1, that humanity is definitely centered. So once again, as we're talking about in our group, when you think about the participants and processes, number 1 really breaks those down a lot more, and it's just not the sort of amorphous things that people can hide behind. So Holly,
Jason, I actually have the breakdown right here.
Okay.
Because I found that when I was listening to it, I was like, am I good enough at SFL that I can hear participant humanizing happening? Like, has that happened in my life? All right. So I oh no.
While you're setting that up, Holly, it's something that we talked about in our group too, in terms of what those participant, the representation was. And in the second text, the textbook, the last sentence of the first paragraph, it says this process became a problem, however. And so the participant here, that the problem is the process, not the underlying racism. You know, it's if only we can solve the problem, then everything is fine, as opposed to actually dealing and acknowledging the racism. And so I think that ties into what both Khan and Andres were saying.
Yeah, and Meg was talking about the logic to it, you know, that there's a problem and then we solved it, and that it was very logical. And another observation that you made too was that the sentence structure was very even and the clauses were very even. I thought that was a great point. In the textbook, you could pull it out, whereas it was more discursive and connected clause by clause in the stamped text. And when I'm looking at my final analysis here, I see that like the analysis also substantiates that. But another thing that came up was that in the stamp text, the use of the North as assimilationists and they comes up 6 times, and the South as segregationists and 4 comes up 4 times, but there's no mention of that in the textbook. They call them Northern and Southern delegates, which is a much more neutralizing phrase than an assimilationist and a segregationist. And then the words slaved and Black people is referenced 10 times as participants, although some of them were in the second participant slot, whereas slaves is mentioned 8 times in the textbook one, but it is never the dominant, never the first, never the lead off participant or the subject. So in traditional grammar, we would call that the direct object, which in a transitive mindset means something is happening to it, right? It doesn't have the agency for the most part that we're looking for. And then the 3/5 compromise is only referenced once in a dominant position here. And here, 3/5 compromise, a compromise, slavery, elections, the number and combinations of slaves and the populations of slaves is referenced much more as a non-human participant. So this is the kind of work I do with my Mount Holyoke's. Full confession, I don't make my middle school students get like this deep. I could. And then the other thing was the processes, which we don't have time to discuss, are also really interesting spread of who can do what to whom, and then the materializing of what they look at. So, thanks.
Wow, it sounds like there was some very interesting discussion in both groups, and I was happy to be able to hear a little bit of each jumping between. Just noting too that we have a couple minutes left. I wondered if we could use these minutes for any questions or critiques or general takeaways that people would like to leave with the group. I think for Holly and Jason and I, we are open to an ongoing conversation. Hope that we'll be in touch with anyone who's interested in further discussing this approach or general movements within the community of SFL scholarship. But the floor is open for any questions, critiques, takeaways. Jen, I see your hand first.
I just wanted to build on the comment that Nigel made in terms of, is this a fair comparison? I think it's a very valid comparison. Please don't take that as a criticism. But one is a textbook and one isn't a textbook. And I think that that's worth discussing and acknowledging with learners as well. And there are different intended audiences, there are different purposes, there are different processes for getting this to print. I think critiquing textbooks is very important, and those larger contextual factors, who approves this, who gets this out there, what is this trying to satisfy, I think it's very important, but they do have different textual features to satisfy those purposes, and it's worth acknowledging that in discussions with students, because I think they can handle it.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to tell you about being a person that was educated in another country for the most part. Like my whole schooling and undergrad and grad part of that was somewhere else. I found these texts complementary, not necessarily for my knowledge. You know, I had no idea what 3/5, and I was like, whoa! And I learned from both texts a lot. And of course, I get your point. The narrative text is much more powerful, and it really gets into these issues. But I didn't see them necessarily as either or. In fact, we were talking about this, Jason and Kathryn, that at this point in time, with our students, in this context, in this moment, it is actually kind of important to have the counter text along with the other text to actually get deeper into these discussions and critical discussions. We might have a lot of people that may not know the history itself, but like that, like just like me, like right now. So both texts could be complementary in that sense, in terms of getting to more criticality, and also about just knowing what the history of this country in that sense.
Thank you. Lucia, I see your hand next. I don't know if you had a different thought or we're building on those comments.
No, I was wondering, I work a lot on oral discourse, and I was wondering whether you have taken that into account when you were comparing the oral versions, and I mean, what the role that phonology has to play there in the two readings and in the ways in which things are read. I don't know if you've considered that, or if you thought of that.
Yeah, that comes up a lot. And the idea that, how do I say, can we play with that? Can we play with, bringing in spoken discourse patterns grammatically into a school text? Who can play with it? Who can play with it, and who can't? And should we all be playing with it a little more? My students tend to be very compliant learners at Mount Holyoke. They tend to be very, have played the academic game quite well. So that is something that bothers them. They don't like one-word sentences, and that they don't like it that he says, and the North was like, no, when he does that. And they come around to it when they use either this community valued text or another one with their learners, and they see that oral discourse patterns aren't bad, right? They're not bad, and they're more interesting, and they're very engaging, and that this strictness between speaking and writing may not be a complete value that we think it is.
I mean, you can be serious, you can be academic, but you don't need to use all these paralinguistic features of saying no and extending segments and all that, but only with tonality, with the division of units, of longer units into smaller units, and with the placing of the focus of the tonicity, you mean a lot. Right. So you don't need to, it's just a few things that you need to take into account, because those are relevant choices too, and meaningful choices.
Meg, I see your hand next, and then Joanna. Oh, you're muted, Meg.
Sorry about that. You think I'd know better by now. This whole idea of, I'm going back to your original slides. The whole notion is SFL, or genre-based pedagogy, racist. And, I think the conversation we just had about the decline, within SFL scholars, and I would say that Ofelia Garcia and Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores, and others who have made this sort of critique about everyday and academic, is a real misunderstanding of SFL, because there's a cline here between the oral and the written, between the everyday. And it's much more contextualized. There's one meaning making system that is instantiated in different ways. And how this gets done in schools as historic political institutions is something to consider. I don't think a pedagogy or a theory can or cannot be racist. It's how it takes shape as enacted as a social practice in a particular context. And, U.S. schools, you don't, read Apple, read anybody else. The history of U.S. education around these issues of democracy is pretty thin. It really had a lot more to do with socialization into certain positionalities. And so I think really the question for me in listening to all of this fascinating discussion, great work, is how do we take up SFL critically in a way that is using the tools to support language, to support learning, disciplinary development, but also that criticality. So we're not just accepting a text as truth and the other as not, because, given the presentation we had this morning around history, honestly, it's not as we can't have these battling texts of truth and untruth, right? So I find this helpful, but I think it needs to be institutionalized and contextualized ideologically within a set of practices, as opposed to naming this or that as racist or not racist.
I'll just add quite quickly that I think that's the point too, is just saying part of the way forward is to acknowledge the history of racism in which these language practices grew up, just to sort of acknowledge it, to say it out loud. It's not groundbreaking in that way, but just to begin to have that conversation out loud and know that we're not interested in, although teachers often do ask, how do I know if a text is racist? And that's kind of not the point, right? It's noticing the text that we use within historically racist contexts. But Joanna, I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well.
Yes, I hope I will be able to collect my thoughts, because there are so many interesting ideas here mentioned. Well, what I thought about was that when actually I think it was Jason who showed the slide with the sources or the theories that critical race theories and all the names. I must say that I'm not familiar with those, but maybe it's just a matter of the context. Here, maybe we don't use this at all, but not much maybe. But I was wondering whether transformative learning and Jackman Zero, this is something that we use here in Europe when we deal with critical theory, not critical race theory, but critical theory. And this is something really interesting when it comes to changing, maybe let's say the other's perspectives and changing the way people see otherness. So this was quite interesting, and I was wondering whether you thought about it, or is it something not really interesting for you? And especially, I thought about it because I know that you in the United States there was a teacher, I think it was in the 60s. I know her for this program called Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes, and I know how transformative effects had on children. So I was just wondering about this, whether you considered other theories like that.
Well, I think right now we've really looked a lot at using critical race theory, because in this North American context, it is one of the few theories that explicitly centers racialization that goes on in school systems. So when you mentioned transformative, I'll be honest, I don't know that. So I need to do some reading and see, are there pieces of it that could be applicable here? But I think for our context right now, CRT really does help us really look at the intersectionalities in the languaging practices and schooling practices, all of that, and how it affects teachers here. But yeah, I wrote that down. So I have some reading to do.
Well, listen, everyone, I thank you so much for taking the time this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. We've got such good here today. Thank you for taking the time and for just engaging in the thought process. We'll share the slides later if you're interested. There's a couple of other rich text pair suggestions that teachers in our spheres have been digging into to try to look at what happens when you discuss them or analyze them together. And so we'll share those examples as well. But we'll also just look forward to learning from you all too in the presentations that are happening the rest of this week. If you don't know when each other's presentations are, please check out that program. Jen has some pre-recorded talks as well you can check out. And we hope you're interested enough to keep the conversation going in the many ways that we can, far apart and across time zones. So thank you again, and take care, everybody.